It was a cold evening, and the streets were alive with people rushing home, lost in their own worlds. But among the crowd, a young boy named Jake always noticed the little girl sitting alone near the bakery. Her clothes were worn, her face tired, but she never begged, just sat quietly, watching people pass by. Something about her loneliness struck him. So one day, he walked up to her with a sandwich and handed it over. She hesitated at first, but then took it with grateful eyes. From that day on, it became a routine. Every evening, Jake would bring her food. He didn't know her name or where she came from, but he saw the way her eyes lit up when he arrived. They didn't talk much, just simple smiles, small conversations. Over time, he learned that her name was Lily, and life had been unkind to her. Still, she never complained. Years passed, and Jake grew up, moving on with life, unaware of what happened to the girl he once helped. Until one fateful night, everything changed. He was driving home from work when a sudden flash of headlights blinded him. Then came the crash. The sound of metal twisting, glass shattering. Darkness followed. When he woke up, he was in a hospital bed, his body aching, confusion clouding his mind. But what he didn't expect was the look on the doctor's face when she walked in. Her hands trembled, eyes filled with emotion, as if she had seen a ghost. And then, with a shaky voice, she whispered his name. What happened next would leave everyone in the room speechless. Jake blinked, trying to focus on the woman standing before him. His head was pounding, his body felt heavy, but it was the look in her eyes that made his heart race. She looked shocked, overwhelmed, like she had just seen someone from her past she never expected to meet again. "Do you remember me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake tried to speak, but his throat was dry. He studied her face, searching his memory, but everything felt foggy. There was something familiar about her, yet he couldn't place it. His silence made her smile softly, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "It's okay," she said, checking his vitals with gentle hands. "You've been through a lot." The room was quiet except for the soft beeping of the machines. Jake wanted to ask her why she reacted that way, why she looked at him like she knew him. But before he could, she turned away, composing herself. Over the next few days, Jake slowly regained his strength. His body was sore, but the doctors assured him he was lucky. The accident could have been much worse. Yet, his mind kept circling back to that doctor, the way she had looked at him, the emotion in her voice. One evening, as the hospital quieted down, she returned to his room. This time, she sat down beside him. "I never forgot you," she said, her voice softer now. Jake's brows furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" She took a deep breath, her hands fidgeting in her lap. Years ago, there was a boy who used to bring food to a little girl sitting outside a bakery. Every day, without fail, he showed up. Even when he didn't have much, he still shared. That boy was you. Jake's breath caught in his throat. Suddenly, memories rushed back, cold evenings, a small girl with bright yet tired eyes, quiet moments of kindness. His heart pounded as he stared at her, realization dawning. "You're Lily," he whispered. A tear slipped down her cheek as she nodded. "And now, it's my turn to help you." Jake couldn't find the words. His mind raced back to those nights outside the bakery, the quiet girl who never asked for anything yet needed so much. And now she was sitting in front of him, no longer that fragile child, but a strong woman in a doctor's coat, holding back tears. "I looked for you," Lily admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "After you stopped coming, I waited. I didn't know your name, where you lived, nothing. And then one day, you were just gone." Jake swallowed, guilt pressing against his chest. He never meant to disappear. His family had moved suddenly, and life had swept him away. He never thought she would remember him. But now, seeing the pain in her eyes, he realized just how much those moments had meant to her. Lily exhaled shakily, as if debating whether to say more. "You were the only person who ever saw me who cared." Her voice caught, but she quickly composed herself. "I told myself that one day I'd find you. And now here you are." Jake ran a hand over his face, overwhelmed. The odds of this reunion seemed impossible, yet it had happened. But something still felt unspoken, lingering between them. "How did you get here?" he finally asked. "What happened after I left?" "You all right, Frank?" she asked, her voice softer now. Frank gave a small smile. "I'm always all right," he said, nodding toward his now empty cup. She took the hint and refilled it, but as she did, she hesitated. "I never knew," she said quietly, "about you." Frank chuckled, shaking his head. "Most people don't," he admitted, "but it doesn't change much. I'm just another old man having coffee." The man who had called him Captain pulled out a chair across from him, watching him closely. "You didn't have to let them go," he said. "They wouldn't have done the same for you." Frank took a slow sip of his coffee before answering. "Maybe not," he said. "But if we start acting like them, what makes us any different?" He let the words settle before continuing. "Besides, I've seen enough fights to know which ones are worth having." The man nodded, a quiet respect passing between them. Outside, the last of the motorcycle engines faded into the distance, leaving behind only the quiet hum of the evening. Frank glanced at the clock on the diner wall, then stood, reaching for his coat. His movements were slow but steady, carrying the quiet dignity of a man who had nothing left to prove. The others watched as he made his way to the door, pushing it open and stepping outside into the cool night air. Before he walked away, he turned back just once, his eyes meeting the waitress's. "See you next week," he said with a wink. And with that, he disappeared into the night, leaving behind a diner full of people who would never look at him, or his quiet strength, the same way again. The father closed his eyes for a moment, his body finally releasing the tension that had gripped it for so long. The grandmother let out a quiet sob, her hands shaking as she whispered a prayer. The crowd, still charged with emotion, began murmuring, relief, anger, disbelief all mixed together. The officer stood alone now, surrounded but utterly isolated. His fate was no longer in his hands. The world had seen the truth, and there was no undoing that. The father looked at him one last time, then turned away. He had more important things to focus on. His daughter was alive. And now, nothing would ever be the same. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the quiet parking lot of a roadside diner. Inside, an elderly man, his hands weathered by time, sat alone at a corner table, stirring a cup of coffee. His name was Frank, a 90-year-old war veteran, a man who had seen more in his lifetime than most could imagine. He had fought for his country, endured hardships, and lived to tell the tale. But today, he faced a different kind of battle, one he never expected. The rumble of motorcycle engines shattered the peaceful afternoon as a group of bikers pulled up outside. Dressed in leather jackets, their presence was impossible to ignore. Laughter and loud voices filled the diner as they stomped inside, their eyes scanning the room. Then they spotted Frank. For reasons known only to them, they decided he was an easy target. Maybe it was his age. Maybe it was the way he sat alone, lost in thought. Whatever the reason, they surrounded his table, smirking as they made cruel jokes at his expense. Frank remained calm, his expression unreadable. He had faced worse, far worse. But that didn't mean he was going to sit there and take it. He reached into his pocket, pulling out an old, battered cell phone. His fingers, steady despite his years, dialed a number. He placed the phone to his ear, speaking in a low, firm voice. What happened next, no one in that diner could have predicted. Within minutes, the atmosphere shifted. The bikers' cocky grins faded. Eyes widened in disbelief. People around the diner started whispering, watching as the unexpected unfolded before them. Whatever Frank had said on that call, it had changed everything. And by the time the truth came out, not a single person in that room would ever look at the old veteran the same way again. The diner grew quiet, the usual clatter of plates and low conversations fading as all eyes shifted toward Frank. The bikers, who had been laughing just moments ago, exchanged uneasy glances. Something about the way the old man held himself, the quiet confidence in his voice, made them pause. One of them, a burly man with tattoos snaking down his arms, leaned in with a smirk. "Who you calling, old man?" he scoffed. The others chuckled, but there was a hesitation now, a crack in their bravado. Frank didn't answer right away. He simply placed the phone back on the table, his gaze steady, unreadable. "You'll find out soon enough," he said, his voice calm but firm. The bikers didn't like that. They weren't used to people standing their ground, especially not someone like Frank, frail-looking, slow-moving, and decades past his prime. But there was something about him now, an unshaken presence that made the air feel heavier. One of the younger bikers shifted on his feet, glancing toward the diner's front window. The parking lot outside was mostly empty, save for their row of gleaming motorcycles and a few scattered cars. Everything seemed normal. And yet, a strange tension was building in the room. A waitress, who had been refilling a customer's coffee a few booths away, hesitated before stepping forward. She had seen Frank come in every few weeks, always polite, always keeping to himself. She also knew that look in his eyes, the look of a man who had nothing to prove, but everything to remember. "Maybe you boys should just leave him be," she suggested carefully. The leader of the bikers scoffed, shaking his head. "Relax, we're just having a little fun," he said, though his tone lacked the same amusement as before. Frank took a slow sip of his coffee, completely unbothered. His phone remained on the table, screen still lit, as if waiting for something. And then just outside, the distant sound of approaching engines rumbled through the quiet evening air. The low rumble outside grew louder, steady and unyielding. The bikers turned their heads toward the diner's front window, their casual arrogance starting to slip. At first, it was just a sound, a distant growl cutting through the quiet evening. But then headlights pierced the dusk, one after another, until the parking lot was bathed in a sea of gleaming chrome and roaring engines. Frank didn't flinch. He simply reached for his coffee again, taking a slow sip as if he had all the time in the world. The bikers, however, weren't so relaxed. Their leader, the one who had been smirking just moments ago, took a step back, his confidence wavering.